Hi, I'm Kelsey Glasser, and if you're watching this video, it means that you want to learn how to blind taste wine. Welcome. Today we're going to go over the deductive tasting method, which is a way of coming at a wine sort of from the outside in, of going into it blind, not knowing what it is, observing clues, and then using those clues to deduce what a wine might be. It really strengthens your palate and allows you the ability to connect your book learning knowledge to your actual sensory experience, which I think overall enhances your palate and makes you more clear on what styles you enjoy, what you don't enjoy, makes it easier to order wine off a bottle list or at a bottle shop, etc. Hopefully overall just increase the pleasure of your wine drinking experience. So as we go, you might want to have a glass of wine with you to kind of go over the rules or test them for yourself, or not, you can just take it all in and then put it to use later. So let's go over how the deductive tasting method works. You might want to just jump straight into drinking it, but that's not how we do this. So first of all, we're just going to look at the wine. Sight is the first topic. Okay, so when we look at a wine, it's helpful to have a white piece of paper next to you and hopefully some good lighting. And the first thing you want to do is hold the wine up to the white piece of paper. This just allows you to observe the color, the depth of color, how transparent or opaque it is. We'll go over all those things right now. So you hold the glass of wine up, and the first thing you want to do is look at the hue of the color. So for a red wine, you can sort of think of ruby as being like a true red right in the middle of the color palette. And then from there, the wine could maybe either lean more purplish or violet, or it maybe could lean more garnet or like a brick color, and even maybe a little more like a tawny or brownish orange. Now, a couple things could affect the hue of the wine. One could be just the grape varietal itself. For instance, some grapes like Gamay have a naturally purpley hue to them, whereas some grape varietals like Nebbiolo have more of a brick hue to them. Or it could be a clue towards age. In general, when a wine is younger, the color is vibrant and brighter. And as a wine ages, the color fades a little bit. And what goes hand in hand with that is another thing you want to look for called rim variation. So rim variation is when you hold the wine up to the paper, you sort of look through it, and what you're looking for is the color at the very center of the disc of wine or the disc of color, versus the color at the very edge of the rim. Meaning, is there a variation between the center of the color and where the wine meets the glass? Often there's a slight variation at the very edge. There's sort of a watery meniscus, which is the fancy wine terminology for that. But what you're really looking for is there a large variation between the rim as you move to the center? And what happens as a wine ages is that the color molecules actually start to fall out of the wine. So when a wine is young, the color is vibrant and it's consistent all the way from the center to the edge. There's my cats, they like wine too. But as a wine ages, the color molecules actually start to fall out, which is why when you open an older bottle, often there's sediment at the bottom. And so an older wine will have a lighter, kind of more tawny brownish color towards the edge, and then it'll be more concentrated at the center. So that gives you clues right away as to the age of the wine. So it could be clues to the grape varietal, maybe leaning more to one hue or another, and also to the age of a wine. Another thing you can look for just from sight is the body of the wine, meaning is it transparent or is it opaque? If you had text below your page, could you sort of see the shapes of the words, or can you not even see through the glass at all? And that could be a clue to the actual varietal, meaning if it's a grape like Pinot Noir that's naturally lighter in body, thinner skinned, then you might be able to see more through it. It might be more transparent. Or is it a fuller bodied varietal, maybe something like Syrah or Cabernet Sauvignon, meaning you probably won't be able to see through it. Another thing it could be a clue towards is the winemaking style. If a wine is filtered or fined, which is pretty common, there'll be less sediment in it, so it's more likely to be transparent. If you're drinking a natural wine, meaning they really haven't interfered with it at all, and they haven't filtered or fined it at all, it's probably gonna have some sediment. So you can get clues towards the body of the wine, how it was made, the age, and the varietal just by looking at it. One last thing to look for in terms of sight is the tears or legs. Often people talk about this a lot, and I don't like to give it too much credence because sometimes it can be misleading. You swirl the glass, and this is going to be hard to see on camera, but you wait a little while for these tears or legs, which is just droplets of the wine, to run down the glass. The reason I don't like to give too much credence to this is sometimes, for instance, if there's detergent residue in your glass or on different types of glasses, they could look a little different. But what you really want to take away from this is if the legs are very thick and very slow moving, it can be a clue towards viscosity, which can be caused by two things. One is residual sugar content, for instance, in a dessert wine. If you think about syrup running down the side of a glass versus water. Syrup is obviously the more viscous of the two. Or it could be a clue towards high alcohol. Similarly, this was from high sugar content. So to give you the brief explanation of alcoholic fermentation, there's sugar content in the grape juice, and that sugar content ferments into alcohol. So the higher the sugar content before fermentation means the higher the alcohol after fermentation. So if you see really thick, slow-moving tears, it means there could be residual sugar left in the wine, or it could be from high alcohol. And the most helpful thing to learn from that is that if there's high alcohol content, my cat has decided to join me. We're at home here. It's a pandemic. If there's high alcohol content, it most likely means that it's from a warmer climate, because if there was a high sugar content in the grape itself, it means the grapes got very ripe. So in order to get grapes very ripe, it needs to either get a lot of sunlight or be in a hot climate. This is a point where I want to talk about a distinction between old world and new world styles, because that's really helpful when you think about blind tasting. What we mean by that, old world refers to any wine region in the world where grape or Vinus vinifera, did I say that right? Vinus vinifera, which is wine making grapes, as opposed to like table grapes, like Concord grapes. Vinus vinifera would be Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Cabernet, everything we make wine from. Wherever those grapes grew wild or indigenous. So essentially that's the European continent, as well as the Middle East. Everywhere else in the world is technically a New World region, meaning we had to import those grapevines to those continents. So when we say New World, we mean the Americas, North America and South America. We mean Australia and New Zealand, and we mean South Africa. All of Europe would be Old World. And the helpful thing to think about, of course, there's exceptions to these rules, but in general, old world styles tend to be cooler climate. They tend to be lower in alcohol, maybe a little bit lighter in body, and in general, less fruit forward and a little more rustic and earth driven. In general, the New World styles, they tend to be hotter, so the fruit gets riper, and they have a tendency, again, this is a generalization, to use more new oak. What oak does is sort of softens the corners of a wine, makes it a little more velvety, makes it a little more like round in style generally, and just makes it just kind of a bigger, softer wine. So in general, if you had a wine, if you think about like a California Cab or a Australian Shiraz or a South African Cabernet, you might think of bigger, bolder, riper styles, Malbec from Mendoza. So in general, if you see higher alcohol, if you start to taste those bigger, bolder, more velvety fruit flavors and less of the rustic, earthy flavors, you might safely guess that it's a New World wine, or at least a more New World style. On the other side of that, European wines tend to use less new oak. So the tannins tend to be a little bit finer, a little bit sharper. The wines tend to be a little lighter in body and generally a little lower in alcohol. And you tend to get more earthy flavors, as opposed to more predominantly fruit flavors. So you might get more leather, tobacco, dust, cedar, those sorts of flavors. And if you're sensing that, you could maybe think it's more of an old world style. Okay, so that was sort of a quick deviation. Now let's get back to the clues. That's just sort of where you want to start cataloging these notes. But after you look at the wine, next is when we smell the wine. And be sure you're taking notes along the way, because you want to start to, what you don't want to do with the deductive tasting method, the worst thing you could do is jump to a conclusion too soon. If you smell one thing and you think, oh, I once had a Sangiovese that smelled like this, your brain is automatically going to start thinking of all the reasons why this could be a Sangiovese. And you end up shooting yourself in the foot. So you really want to be unbiased as you're tasting it and just be an observant detective, sort of. So write down the clues, and then at the very end, we will gather them into some sort of conclusion. So next up, we smell the wine. And this is arguably the most important part of the process. Great blind tasters can guess what a wine is just by smelling it. So swirl the wine. When we swirl the wine, it allows oxygen to come in contact with the ethers in the wine, which sort of breaks them apart and does the same thing. You're basically aerating the wine. So you're more able to smell the aromas as they come in contact with oxygen, which is why when a wine is oxidized, meaning it had too much oxygen over a long period of time, those flavors are sort of stale because they've been used up in a way. Okay, so let's swirl it and stick your nose in the glass. And you can already start to be observing how aromatic a wine is from how close you have to get to a wine to get those aromas, meaning super aromatic wines, you'll be able to smell them from back here, maybe like a Gewürztraminer or a Riesling. Some other more neutral varietals, maybe like a Chardonnay, you have to get your nose pretty close into the glass. And as you smell the wine, you first want to be thinking of fruit. We always start with fruit. So for red wines, it could sort of fall into one of three categories in terms of fruit. Red fruit, black fruit, and like blue or purple fruit. So for red fruit, we could be smelling cherries, currants, raspberries, strawberries, things like that. For black fruits, maybe boysenberry, marionberry, black cherry, cassis, black currant. For blue and purple fruits, things like blueberries, plum, fig. So start writing down any fruit qualities that come to mind. And then think about the state of the fruit or the quality of the fruit. If we're thinking about a cherry, does it smell like a tart cherry that just ripened, still on the vine, very fresh? Or does it smell like a cherry that's overly ripe, that maybe it's the end of summer and it's been on the vine for too long and you can really smell the sweetness? Or does it smell like cherry jam or dried cherries, like cherry leather? Because those start to give you a clue, whereas the fruit itself, like if it's a cherry, maybe then we could think, oh, Sangiovese or certain varietals often smell like cherry. But was it a Sangiovese grown in a cold climate where the fruit might be just ripe, kind of on the tartar side? Or would it be a Sangiovese from a really hot climate where the sugar got really ripe and it smells sort of jammy or almost dried? So that's another helpful thing that gives you a clue to the climate or the grape's access to cold nights and warm sun. So after we think about the fruit and the quality of the fruit, then we want to start thinking of earth components. Meaning, and when we say earth, it could mean the soil type. So do you get any smells of like dust or dirt? And if you're smelling that, does it smell like a wet forest floor, maybe somewhere in the Pacific Northwest? Or does it smell like a hot, dusty, corral, maybe somewhere in Spain or in a hot climate? Again, these are clues to climate. Or to the vineyard itself where the grape was grown. Are we getting, often with white wine, we can smell limestone or chalk or granite. When people talk about minerality, that's what they're referring to. You can also sense that when we taste it as well, but sometimes you can smell it too. Sometimes you smell smoke or gravel. And this could also be indigenous in the grape varietals themselves. But again, it's a clue towards the vineyard and the climate. In addition, for earth aromas, we could be thinking of, are we getting any woodsy smells like cedar? Or sometimes with wines, you'll get sort of a green, like stems. Often they'll ferment the grapes with the whole clusters of the grapes intact, and you can almost smell this sort of green astringency that comes from the stems. or in white wines will smell great, like fresh herbs or green bell pepper. Sometimes grape varietals have things called pyrazines in them, which are the same compounds found in peppers. So it's this very herbaceous kind of peppery smell that's in jalapeno, green bell pepper. And in grape varietals, it's common in where it lives in Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, a couple other varietals as well. Then we want to think of maybe spice aromas. So do we smell things like anise, ginger, clove, common spices? Often what spice aromas come from is oak usage. So one thing to sort of log in your notes is that French oak gives distinct baking spice aromas. So nutmeg, clove, allspice, cinnamon. If you smell those smells in a red wine or a white wine, it's probably a safe guess that the wine spent time in oak. You could also get notes often as wine ages, especially white wine. The sort of bright, fresh fruit smells fade off, and you get these kind of waxy smells of chamomile, ginger, saffron, and that can also be a clue to the wine's age. So beyond that, that's pretty much it for the smells. You would just want to write down everything you smell, and again, we'll look at it in a moment. On this particular red wine, I should have said with the site as well, the color is fairly consistent. There's a little bit of rim variation. It's sort of a true ruby, leaning a little bit more garnet towards the edges, garnet or brick. I would say, judging by just this little bit of variation, probably in the 5-ish year range. Not super slow moving legs or tears. I would say they're kind of slow to form, but then moving fairly quickly. Judging by the looks of it, I would guess between 12.5% and 14% alcohol. And then with the aromas, I get sort of a cross of red and black fruits. So I would say black cherry, a little bit of cassis, red currant and black currant, maybe a hint of blackberry. Definitely get some spice smells, or an earth smells. I get sort of cedar. There's a little bit of earthiness, almost like a bark dust kind of smell. A little bit of tobacco, and a little bit of like allspice. So I think there's probably a little bit of oak on there, but it's subtle. It doesn't hit you in the face with it. A little bit of smokiness as well. Okay, so next up, everyone's favorite part, we're going to taste the wine. And I'm gonna get my little spit cup here. You don't have to spit the wine, but know that when you put it in your mouth, often you'll see wine people do something which would probably be bad manners at a dinner party, but swish it around your mouth and almost gargle it a little bit. You'll see what I mean, and you can practice this on your own at home. Basically what you're doing is aerating the wine in your mouth. And so if you just go straight to swallowing it, you are missing the opportunity to just gather extra clues and flavors. And you'll see what we can detect by doing this. But even if you're spitting or swallowing, just really swish it around in your mouth to coat your mouth so we can sense the texture, the acidity, the tannin, and more of those flavors. So I'll do it. You can do it on your own at home. I know it's kind of gross, but it really does help you taste better. So as soon as you taste the wine, and some people say you can actually taste it better by spitting. Again, it just sort of aerates it. You immediately want to start thinking about the flavors. Do the flavors confirm what we're tasting, confirm what we smelled? So does the fruit smell, or is it the same fruit flavors? Are we still getting sort of like black cherry, black currant, maybe a little bit of blackberry? In this case, yes. Are there any new flavors? Does the quality of the fruit, maybe it smelled really jammy, but maybe it actually tastes pretty fresh on the palate. In this case, the palate kind of confirms the nose. I'm getting those same fruit flavors. I get even a little bit more spice when I taste it. And I get a real gravelly sensation in my mouth. Which again, we talked about minerality or the soil type, and often that's a physical sensation you can feel in your mouth. Like, does it taste kind of chalky or gravelly? And often that's a clue towards the soils in the vineyard. The other big two things we want to notice when we taste a wine are acidity and tannin, and they're easier to detect than you might think. For acidity, after we swirl the wine around in our mouth and spit it or swallow it, maybe try it both ways, see which one works better for you. Hold your mouth still and see how much saliva your mouth is producing. How much does your mouth water? The more your mouth waters, the more you salivate, the higher the acidity is. And if you think about biting into a lemon, your mouth would pucker and just start oozing saliva. That was a gross turn of phrase, but you know what I mean. That would be an example of high acidity, as opposed to taking a bite of apple pie. Your mouth, it's fruit, but it's cooked and it's sugary, and there probably wouldn't be as much acidity in it. So let's do it here and do it with your wine at home and figure out how much saliva your mouth starts to produce. So kind of hold your mouth still. A lot of saliva in my mouth. Not that you ever wanted to know that. But I would say this wine is fairly high acid. We talk about medium acidity. On the technical scale, it's medium plus, medium minus, and then high and low. I would say this is about medium plus acidity. If you're familiar with certain wines, maybe like German Riesling or a Chablis, those wines would be examples of high acidity. I would say this is about medium plus acidity. Then the other thing to detect is tannin. Tannin is how much your mouth dries out, or how much do you sort of have to lick your teeth off, like after you drink a wine. That's an example of tannin. And if you don't know what tannins are, they're basically compounds that live in the skins of grapes. For instance, tea has them. Have you ever over-steeped a cup of tea and had it taste sort of bitter and like coat your mouth? That's because the tea tannins were sort of in the liquid for too long. So it's not a matter of things being, wine being made for too long or too little. It's just to know that tannins live in the skins of wines. That's what they are. And thinner skinned grape varietals tend to have lower tannins, whereas thicker, for example, like Pinot Noir, even Gamay, less tannic wines, as opposed to Cabernet Sauvignon or Syrah or even Nebbiolo have very high tannins. So again, let's taste it and then think about how much you have to lick your teeth off after you spit the wine. It's pretty tannic as well. One thing, so it's pretty dry, but the other thing to think about with tannins goes back to this oak conversation of New World versus Old World. Oak will soften the tannins in a wine. So if you think about a California Cabernet versus a Bordeaux, they'll both be full in body. They'll both have fairly high tannins, but the California Cab, which probably spent more time in new oak, will have sort of rounder, broader edges. Again, it'll be jammy or more velvety. That's also in part because the fruit will be riper, whereas a Bordeaux will also be will be lower alcohol, higher acidity because of the cooler climate. But the tannins will generally be a little more astringent, a little more fine. They might feel sharper, but maybe a little more delicate because they don't have the extra oomph and sort of roundness of the oak. In this case, I definitely feel like it's more old world tannins. The tannins are a little more astringent, a little bit sharper, and a little bit finer, which goes along with the sort of more subtle baking spice notes that I smelled, the higher acidity, the fact that the tears didn't look overly slow moving. So all of this now is the point where we can sort of start to put all these clues together. So let's go down our list. We looked at it. We saw that it looked fairly full bodied. I couldn't quite see through it, so it's probably a fuller bodied varietal. There was a little bit of rim variation, probably about 5 years in age, if I had to guess. With the legs, we saw that it was probably mid-range alcohol, not overly ripe, so probably not from a super hot climate. With the smells, we got kind of red and black fruits. We got a little bit of earth. We got a little bit of gravel. We got some spice. So from all that, we can probably guess that it was the quality of the fruit was pretty fresh. It wasn't overly ripe. So we can probably think cooler climate, a grape varietal that has sort of red and black notes to it. Probably Old World based on all of those like earthy things we were smelling, cedar, tobacco, gravel. Same when we tasted it and we got that gravelly sensation. Maybe it was grown in gravel soils. A little bit of baking spice, but it was restrained. And the fact that the tannins were fairly dry leads me to think it didn't spend a lot of time in new oak. So it's probably an Old World style. So then I can start thinking, okay, where in the Old World grows wines that are still fairly full in body, that have kind of black fruit aromas, that might have gravel soils. And this is the point where if you just took all those notes correctly and then looked at the answer, then you could be like, oh, this is a region in the world where these tasting notes fit in. Don't feel bad if you don't automatically know, okay, 5 regions in Europe could match these characteristics. Then you can look at the answer, compare it to your notes and be like, so that's what this wine tastes like. And maybe do a little reading on that particular region and varietal. For this wine, I'll just tell you what it is. This is a Bordeaux. So it's a 2014 Bordeaux, which means, again, if you didn't know exactly what that meant, you could look it up and you would find out that Bordeaux is made of Cabernet Sauvignon, often blended with a little bit of Merlot, Cabernet Franc, sometimes a little bit of Malbec, and sometimes a little bit of Carmenère. But then you could start doing a little research and then know what an Old World, Bordeaux wine tastes like, a Cabernet from the Old World, from Bordeaux, and do a little reading. So the most important thing is the clues. At the end, if you do have the wine knowledge to say, okay, based on this, maybe I think it could be some sort of Spanish wine, like a cooler climate Spanish wine, or it could be Bordeaux, or maybe it could be like a Super Tuscan, which is Cabernet made in Italy and Tuscany. So you could maybe make some educated guesses, and those would be great. But the most important thing is to get those clues down. Often when you're taking your wine tests to become a sommelier, they'll give you a couple options at the bottom of the tasting grid. And I had a teacher who always told me, as you're doing the blind tasting, the best thing to do is cover up those options. Because again, you don't want your brain to immediately go in one direction and then try to justify that answer. You want to write all your clues and then force yourself to come up with, if you have the knowledge, 3 different possibilities for what it could be. Then look back over all of it and say, okay, out of those 3, I think these clues mostly fit this particular one. Then check your answer. And if you're ordering the tasting kit from us, all the answers are below the bottle. But you can use this, just have someone buy a wine and pour it for you blind, or start hosting a blind wine tasting night once a week, COVID permitting, and tell everyone to bring a bottle in a brown bag. That's the best way to improve your wine tasting skills and get a better idea of what your palate does enjoy. If you then had tasted this wine with me, and maybe we tasted alongside a California Cabernet, it's always fun to do compare and contrasting. Then you might know, wow, I really liked the California one more. So maybe my palate leans more to New World right now. So maybe I could explore other New World style wines. Maybe I should look at Australia or South Africa or Argentina. Or if you liked the Bordeaux better, maybe you could think, okay, maybe I should look at more Spanish or Italian or German wines. And maybe I enjoy those a little more. So this was our blind tasting tutorial. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have fun with all your blind tasting pursuits. Feel free to reach out if you ever have any questions. My restaurant in Portland, Oregon is called Arden. You're probably watching this from Portland, but if you're watching for it from afar, look us up, send us a message, and I will get back to you. Thank you so much and have fun.